Hello, Sam Moser here on Moser Makes. So this week I've been working with concrete to make some planters. Now a common DIY method to make a cylindrical planter like this is to take a 5-gallon plastic bucket and a 2-gallon plastic bucket. And what you do is you nest the 2-gallon bucket inside of the 5-gallon bucket and use that as your mold. And this works pretty good. It'll create a planter about this size, and it gives you a pretty good, thickness for the walls, about 1 inch thick. The issue, though, that I've seen with this method is that when you go to get the concrete out of the mold, you usually end up destroying the buckets. It gets kind of stuck in there, and you have to cut or break apart the plastic. Now, if you're only going to make one planter, this might not be that big of an issue. But if you want to make multiple planters, this starts to get kind of wasteful. So I wanted to try and solve that problem. I wanted to come up with a solution where I could use the same set of buckets to make multiple planters, and I also wanted to be able to use that same mold to make a little saucer or drip tray, because I like to be able to add a drainage hole in the bottom of my planters. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the solution I came up with for doing this, as well as some other tips and tricks I learned along the way so that you can also successfully make some planters like these. Okay, first let's talk about the materials you'll need for this. The first thing being a bag of concrete mix. I used Quikrete 5000, but a different concrete mix would work as well. Next, as discussed, you'll want a 5-gallon bucket as well as a 2-gallon bucket. It's also handy to have an additional 5-gallon bucket for mixing the concrete in, and a concrete trowel. We're going to be cutting these buckets apart, and for that I find a utility knife and this little hacksaw to be quite handy for that. After we cut the buckets apart, we're going to tape it back together, and for that I recommend a good waterproof tape. I used some house wrap tape. I'll link to all these products in the description below. Here are some other odds and ends I used, but that aren't key. If you want to drill a drainage hole at the bottom of the planter, you will need a masonry drill bit for this. This was my first concrete project actually, and what I found is that with concrete work, you basically have a lot of prep work, and then you mix and pour the concrete, and then you have a lot of time where you just have to let it sit and dry. So the first thing in that prep work we need to do is get our buckets or our molds ready. And in order to make it easy to pull the planter out of the mold without breaking the buckets, we're going to basically intentionally break the buckets. We're going to first cut them apart in a way that's going to make them easy to pull off the concrete once it's dry. So this is how I cut the buckets. And I cut both the 2-gallon bucket and the 5-gallon bucket in mostly the same way. And that is that I cut it into 2 pieces. And first I cut off the bottom section. Boom. And then I cut straight down the top of this. This seemed to be just enough to where you can separate the bucket and pull it off of the concrete easy enough. I wouldn't recommend cutting the buckets up any further than this because it already is kind of slow and tedious to tape them back together, especially because you want to get everything nice and lined up. So now let me show you the actual cutting process. I started out by marking a cut line on my 2-gallon bucket. I used a marking gauge to make a line 1 inch up from the bottom. The line is a little hard to see, so I traced over it with a Sharpie to make it easier to see in the video. Next, I used a box cutter to start a cut along the line, and then I switched to this mini hacksaw. Any similar saw with an open end and a fine-toothed blade should work for this. The plastic cut pretty easy with the hacksaw, but it left a rough edge. I used some sandpaper to smooth out the edge after the cut. Then I repeated this for the 5-gallon bucket, but on this one I marked the line 2 inches up from the bottom of the bucket. On this one, I tried making the cut only using the utility knife. This worked as well, but it was a little more difficult and required quite a bit of force to move the blade through the plastic. This felt more dangerous than the saw did. If you're having to put a lot of force behind the blade, be really conscious of the path of the blade if it were to slip from the cut, and keep your other hand well out of the way. This cut with the utility knife had a cleaner edge that didn't need to be sanded, but it wasn't as straight. It ended up as more of a wavy line. Next, I marked a vertical line on the upper portion of each bucket and cut this. I used the mini hacksaw for both of these. Even though it leaves a rougher edge, I found it a little safer and easier to use for this. Initially, this was all the cuts I made to the buckets, but after doing a few concrete pours, I found one other modification that helped quite a bit. So, with these buckets, the inside has a pretty smooth edge. On the outside though, at the bottom, there's a lip that sticks quite a bit out. So for the bigger bucket, which forms the outside of the mold, this isn't really a problem because we're using the inside and we have that smooth edge. But on our inner piece of the mold, I found that that little lip that sticks off was causing an issue for me. And not an issue with how it looks because it's the inside of the planter, so it doesn't really matter how it looks, but that little lip on the bucket was making it harder to pull out this inside piece at the very bottom of the mold, which is also the hardest piece to get to. So what I did is I took a knife and I cut off this bottom lip. Alright, you should be able to see it there. So I cut along the edge and just tried to create a smooth transition between the side and the bottom of the bucket. For comparison, here's a close-up of what that little lip I'm talking about looks like if it's not cut away. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is tape these buckets back together to get them ready to pour the concrete in. But first, one other trick that you should do before you cut the buckets apart to make them easier to tape back together. And that's to make sure you have some marks on the outside of the buckets that'll help to make sure you get the bottom and the top aligned properly when you're taping it back together. So on my big bucket, there was already some graphics on the bucket, and so I can use that to make sure the bucket lines up. Easy. On my smaller bucket though, it didn't have any decals or anything on it. It was just plain. So on this one, I added a little Sharpie mark. And I used that to make sure I get the top and bottom pieces lined up in the original position before taping them back together. Taping the buckets back together is pretty straightforward. Just go slow and try to get everything lined up evenly. Also, try to get a good even seal without too many creases in the tape, so that the concrete or water can't seep out. On the outside bucket, I recommend only adding tape to the outside. On my first attempt, I also put tape on the inside, but I found this ends up leaving an impression you see in the concrete. On the inner bucket, it's fine to put tape on both sides. Alright, so I got both buckets taped back together. Now, before we pour the concrete though, there's one more problem we gotta solve for. And that is, how do we keep this bucket in the right place inside this bucket once we pour the concrete? And the reason this is a concern is because once we pour the concrete in our bigger bucket and then put the smaller bucket in, two things are going to want to happen. This small bucket is going to want to float up to the top of the concrete, and it's not going to want to stay perfectly centered. So let me show you the solution I came up with to keep the inner bucket in the right spot. And that's these alignment blocks. In the video description, I'll put a link to a template you can download and print so that you can cut your own blocks. I cut these out of some scraps of 3/4 inch plywood, but the material you make them from isn't so important as long as you get the size and shape correct, and that printout should help with that. Let me show you how they work. I want the bottom of my planter to be 1 inch thick, so I need this inner bucket to sit 1 inch up from the bottom of the outer bucket. So to simulate 1 inch of concrete, I'm going to put these 1 inch tall blocks at the bottom, and then I'll put the inner bucket back in. Alright, so these blocks have a groove in the top that fits around the outer bucket, and a groove at the bottom that fits around the top of the inner bucket. And we're going to place the three evenly around the perimeter, like so. So with these in, you can see that there's now an even spacing in between the two buckets, and as long as we sit something heavy over these blocks at the end, it's gonna prevent this inner bucket from being able to float up past the height we want it to sit at. I found it helpful to line up one of these blocks with the seam in our bucket here, just to support that section of the bucket since it's a little weaker from the cut. I also found it helpful to draw some lines inside here representing the level that we can pour the concrete to around the edges here to get the right height that we want. Basically, I'm pouring the concrete as high as I can while avoiding this upper section of the bucket. All right, so let's mix the concrete. I didn't measure the exact amount of concrete mixed for each pour. Aim for making a little less than you think you will need, because it's easier to mix more than it is to figure out what to do with the extra concrete if you mix too much. I didn't measure the water either. I just added a little at a time and mixed until the consistency was about right. I'm not an expert here, but I believe we're going for a consistency of thick oatmeal. A couple other last bits of bucket prep worth mentioning is to make sure the surfaces of the bucket that'll be in contact with the concrete are clean. It also helps to spread some paste wax or cooking spray onto the plastic. Concrete doesn't really like to stick to plastic in the first place, but this gives a little extra insurance that once the concrete cures, it'll be easy-ish to separate it from the plastic. Once the concrete is mixed, pour some, but not all of the concrete into the bigger bucket. At this point, it's good to try and work out some of the air bubbles before proceeding further. Shaking or vibrating the concrete helps with this. To make this easier, you can use something like a jigsaw without a blade to vibrate the bucket. An electric palm sander can also work for this. You should be able to see the air bubbles rising to the top. The more bubbles you get out, the better. After this, we'll put the inner bucket and spacers in place, then add more concrete along the edges. Now I placed something heavy on top to hold everything down and then worked out more of the air bubbles. The vibration also helps get the concrete level. I then added more concrete around the edges until it reached the height I wanted, and then repeated the process for the air bubbles. Once you have enough concrete in, and you feel like you've shaken it up enough, then you just have to let it sit. The longer the better. Let it sit overnight at least, but a full 24 hours is probably better before taking it out of the mold. Once the concrete has cured, we can take it out. I began by removing the tape and peeling away the upper section of the outer bucket. This section generally comes off pretty easy. The bottom part tends to stick more, and this one needed a bit of a nudge. Depending on how long it's been in the mold, the concrete can still be a little soft, so be careful and try and not scratch it with anything as you take it out. To remove the inner bucket, I started by peeling the tape off the inside. Then I peeled the top section of the bucket away from the concrete by curling the bucket in on itself. The bottom section can be a little tougher to get out. Once I was able to work a section of the edge loose, I was usually able to use that to pull the whole thing up and out. And there it is. That's the planner. The process for making one of the drip trays is pretty much the same, but you only need to use the bottom section of each bucket. The concrete will continue to cure and get harder over time, but initially it's still a little soft, so again, be careful with it. Before planting anything, I would let them fully dry and then give them a quick rinse down. Another optional step is to apply concrete sealer to the inside before adding a plant. There are some pros and cons to this in terms of moisture control and soil pH balances, but that's a whole discussion on its own. Anyway, here they are. Pretty snazzy. It's a fun project, and I hope you're able to make some too. Take care, everyone.